Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Hello, and welcome to Student Affairs Live, the online learning community for student affairs educators. I'm your host, Keith Edwards, filling in as a guest host for Heather Shea. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm a speaker, consultant, and coach. You can find out more about me at keithedwards.com. Today, I'm connecting with three scholars who have focused on pedagogies beyond the classroom. We'll be discussing what pedagogies can best foster student learning in student affairs work. We welcome your comments, questions, and participation. Follow along on the back channel and tweet at the hashtag HigherEdLive. Thanks to our team behind the scenes helping with the back channel today. In a moment, I'll introduce you to our panelists who have joining me today, but first I need to acknowledge and thank those who make Student Affairs Live possible. Student Affairs Live is part of the Higher Ed Live network, and you can tune into episodes with regular host Heather Shea and Tony Duty on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern. If you're unfamiliar with past episodes, we highly recommend you check out and favorite the archive link that we're tweeting out now. Student Affairs Live is sponsored by M. Stoner. M. Stoner and the Council for Advancement and Support of Education, CASE, are conducting a survey of how schools, colleges, and universities use various digital tools and technologies in alumni relations, communications, fundraising, and marketing. We invite you to participate. Results will help you benchmark your institution's digital advancement initiatives and track trends related to the use of digital tools and educational advancement. The survey should take about 20 minutes to complete. Respondents who complete the survey and supply their email address will receive a complimentary copy of the survey findings and will be entered to win access to M. Stoner's on-demand course, Digital Storytelling for Higher Education. We're getting a link of that survey tweeted out right now. Student Affairs Live is also exclusively sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators International. Particularly relevant to today's episode, the 12th Annual Institute on the Curricular Approach, formerly the Residential Curriculum Institute, will challenge you to rethink the practices and grounding philosophies of student learning and student success beyond the classroom. We're getting a link out about the Institute on the Curricular Approach now. And I just mentioned that as co-chair of that institute and someone who's participated in that for a long time, that is what has brought us to our topic today. In conversations with people, we're always looking for new ways to engage learners around the learning goals and outcomes that we've set through a curricular approach. And really, I wanted to learn more about some different pedagogies and theory and concepts and strategies we can use. So that is in many ways what has led us to today's episode. So we're here to talk today about transformative learning that disrupts a learner's worldview. That transformative learning involves the development of knowledge, skills, and emotions. What experiential pedagogies best facilitate this kind of transformative student learning? What pedagogies can best support student learning around social justice? And how can student affairs educators apply these directly in our interactions with students and indirectly in the design and implementation of our initiative? So let's get on with the conversation. Welcome to our participants and our panelists. As our panelists introduce themselves, you can view our website for their detailed bios, which is getting sent out now. I will note we did have one last-minute scratch. Ruth Harper was not able to join us. She unfortunately is sick and has a fever, and too much snuggling with the grandbabies is the suspect. So Greg has decided to join us, and we'll get to know more about him in a little bit. But Jane, if you could go ahead and start us off with a brief introduction.
Okay, well, after I retired 2 years ago, so it's hard to make an introduction brief. But what I wanted to say was I've always been fascinated with the process of learning, the process. And I spent the formative part of my career running all the RA training programs at UConn. And I was teaching a class at 4 o'clock in the afternoon that they were getting credit for, didn't fit in their major, they weren't motivated. And I realized that what I really needed to do was a combination of stand-up comedy and social justice, this matters stuff. So that's how I got into all this. And I have been doing that in one form or another ever since. And I think that's enough for now. It was a long time ago. My pronouns are, I don't know how to do this, hers, her, she. Are those the ones I'm supposed to use?
Yep, you did it.
Good. That's me, female. Thank you.
Right. And we've got our first suggestion for an innovative pedagogy of stand-up comedy. So thanks for that. Vijay, over to you.
Extremely important in that.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Vijay Kanagala again. He, him, his pronouns. I am an assistant professor of higher education and student affairs at the University of Vermont. And a little bit about my interests, research interests, scholarly interests. I am fascinated and interested in engaging with studies that look at the experiences of underrepresented, underserved, understudied populations on our college campuses, and most specifically, South Asian and Latinx students. I identify South Asian, so an interest in that. And I also, most specifically for the topic today, I'm also interested in thinking about faculty development and contemplative education from a pedagogical standpoint, in terms of how do faculty engage with students as whole beings. So stop it at that.
Great. And since Ruth was a late scratch early this morning, she suggested Greg join us, who's someone who she co-wrote a chapter with. We don't have Greg's bio info up on the website because we weren't able to make that change quickly enough, but we'll get a bio tweeted out here. But Greg, if you go ahead and tell us a little bit more about you.
Yeah, my name is Greg Heiberger. I'm an assistant professor in biology and microbiology at SDSU, South Dakota State University. I've got a traditional student affairs background, master's in student affairs, PhD in higher ed administration, but my research really for the last 10 to 12 years has been about using social media to expand the classroom walls, expand the amount of time and resource that we can engage with students. So that goes all the way back to 2005 and one of the first studies looking at Facebook and its connection to student involvement on campus. And then we did an experimental design Twitter study back in 2009 and 2011, really looking at ways that we can utilize Twitter to expand the classroom walls in a first year seminar. And that's kind of evolved over time. I've done some iPad work, some work with Snapchat and nutrition, and this summer working on a project with Lower Brule, Native American reservation here in South Dakota, and a group of students in a summer research program there. And we're using Zoom and Slack, and we have college students mentoring those students via technology throughout the summer, focused on cultural competencies and trainings, as well as scientific practices around research design and development. So I've got a passion for higher ed and a passion for really finding the nexus of student affairs and academic affairs and really making partnerships and bridging the gap across the silos on campus.
Wonderful. This is so great. We've already talked about stand-up comedy, contemplative practices, social media, Zoom and Slack. We're off to a great start about all these different strategies for facilitating learning. So I just want to begin because really today's conversation is about pedagogy beyond the classroom, and it's really organized around two books. So the first one is Learning Everywhere on Campus. And this is a book that Jane Freed and Ruth Harper edited and it's an added volume. They both wrote several chapters. Greg contributed to a chapter around social media and scientific pedagogy. So we'd really encourage people to take a look at that. And then this book, Senti Pensante, which is by Laura Rendon, a great book about blending the head and the heart and the inner and the external world, which we'll hear about a little bit more, Vijay, and how he was a part of that project. But as we're thinking about pedagogy, I think that's one of the things that Jane really talks about in that book is this is a term that faculty and educators use, but sometimes we don't claim it as much in student affairs. So Jane, if you could just begin by telling us a little bit about what pedagogy is and how maybe we could claim it a little bit more in our student affairs practice.
It's an interesting problem, and when I looked it up, I found out all kinds of things I didn't know before. Pedagogy is basically teaching, but it's the art and the science of. And the word went way back to Aristotle, Socrates, etc. The pedagogue was the person who took the kid to the teacher. That was like the babysitter, but the pedagogue was also the person who taught the kid all the social skills in ancient Greece. So in many ways, we do more pedagogy than other people do because that's exactly what we're doing, is teaching people social skills and all the variety of ways to live in the world. So anyhow, I got very interested in pedagogy because I happened to stumble on some conversation about brain-based learning, cognitive neuroscience, And all of a sudden I thought, oh my God, that's what we do, and we never talk about it. We've been doing it without knowing what we were doing, and now it's time to talk about it. All faculty members have some sense of what their pedagogy is, their approach to teaching, and what they want people to learn. Student affairs teaches people things all the time, and we never talk about pedagogy. Therefore, we have a language barrier that the other two panelists have alluded to already. We say we're educators. We haven't historically defined what that meant. We haven't done as much as we needed to do with learning outcomes. And my particular thing is you can't measure learning outcomes very effectively if you don't know what learning inputs are. And we haven't paid as much attention to learning inputs based on the science of learning that has developed over the last 20 years. So I think that's really where I want to push student affairs. We cannot be intellectually lazy about this. We have to sit down and read some books with big words and hard language that we never heard of before, and then have the nerve to sit down and talk to a faculty member and say, hey, I've been studying this. You know anything about this? Can we talk? Which is something that I did with every staff I ever supervised or worked with. Go talk to faculty, find out why they like to teach. So pedagogy, and I'm stealing this from Robert Zoll, has 4 parts, and we do it in every single training program we run. The first thing is you have to give people information. That, unfortunately, is as far as most people get when they talk about pedagogy. People need new information from books, from lectures, from reading, from online, from wherever they get it. They need new information. So that's cognitive, but the other 3 don't get discussed as much. The second one is affective engagement, and that means people have to care about what they're learning. There's nothing more horrible than learning something that you don't know why you need to know it, and you're going to forget it as soon as the test is over. It's a waste of your time, professor's time, and everybody's money. So affect is critical, and it was excluded from the Western model of teaching and learning sort of right after the Renaissance, and certainly during the scientific revolution. The third thing in pedagogy that's critical is behavior. You have to do something. Because your body, you know, they always talk about the mind-body split. There is no mind-body split. Where do you think your mind is? It's in your body, or at least your brain is in your body. So you have to do something. It could be talk to somebody. It could be dig a hole. It could be help to build a house. It could be serve meals at a soup kitchen, or it could be tutoring a little kid. But you got to do something in order to learn effectively. And the fourth piece of pedagogy is metacognition, and that is a big fancy word for why do I need to know this and what does it really mean? But metacognitive learning is the learning that anchors learning in the total brain throughout all over the brain, so that when you remember something, you also remember why it's important to you. And for me, that particular area of metacognition almost always has to do with race. That's my big thing. It's like, why do I need to know this? You need to know this because people are getting hurt when you don't know this. So that's just a simple answer to that. So that's what pedagogy is from a neuroscientific perspective. Cognition, affect, behavior, and metacognition. Student affairs people, from my point of view, need to learn how to talk about that, because academic faculty, as a general rule, outside the laboratories or the art classrooms, but in the traditional verbal liberal arts, just do cognitive. And we were all just trained to do cognitive because that's what doctoral programs are basically about. And we even have a belief that says that engaging your personal self and feelings is disruptive to learning, and it is just the opposite. So having said that, I think I've used my time up and I should probably stop right now. But that's kind of why I care about pedagogy. We teach people some of the most important stuff they ever learn in college, and we don't talk about how we teach. There's no gap. If you, instead of talking about how do you teach, how do I teach, if we talked about what do students need to learn, we wouldn't have a gap. Paradigm shift. End of conversation.
Right. Well, and that's really the whole point of Learning Reconsidered, right? Which is that there isn't a classroom experience and an out-of-classroom experience. There's a college experience.
That is correct.
And I think you can make a great point that as student affairs educators, we don't often talk about pedagogy. We don't often talk about the process. And I also think in many ways we are better prepared than faculty are, because faculty learn about how to be discipline focused. A physics faculty member learns about physics and usually learns after they start teaching through maybe trial and error, maybe good mentorship, or maybe the Center for Teaching and Learning on campus, some ways to go about teaching more effectively. And although we don't think about it as pedagogy, I think student affairs educators have a lot better preparation to facilitate learning. And then, of course, you're also pointing to this shift from pedagogy being about how a teacher teaches to shifting to how do learners learn and how do we navigate that process, which is a great shift for us to be learner-centered.
You know, I mean, I'm just thinking about talking about the shift, right? And what I've encountered in the classroom is when I try to introduce pedagogy as a concept, as a tool for students to learn, it's always interesting to see, or fascinating to see how students don't understand what I'm talking about. Because to them, I'm the expert in the classroom, and they're going to be these, stationary bodies sitting and wanting to, they're the containers that receive all of the knowledge that I'm going to pour out, right? And so it's always an interesting thing to introduce pedagogy and my pedagogical ways of doing in the classroom and being in the classroom, and to see the resistance sometimes from students, but also see the light bulbs go off 2 years down the lane when they realize that, oh, that's actually probably the most important learning aspect of the program or the classroom that they've had. So it's fascinating to see that connection.
Yeah, and I think you're pointing to how many learners have been socialized to expect the sage on the stage kind of process, and if and they're maybe more comfortable with that, even though it may not be the best way for them to learn. It's what they're familiar with, and so they tend to go to that. Vijay, you were go ahead, Greg. You were going to get in there.
I would just also say I think we're going to see a shift in the next 10 to 15 years, and I think student affairs needs to be the ones with their finger on the pulse about this shift. And because I think if you look at what's happening in a lot of K-12 systems around customized learning and active learning, that the sage on the stage may change, but I think it's also going to create a couple of classes of learners as they transition into our universities, right? There's going to be a class of learners that has experienced active learning and have been active in the learning process because the system that they went through for those 12 to 13 years of pre-collegiate life prepared them for an active classroom, prepared them for a pedagogy where the faculty member is mentoring and challenging and working in groups and doing backwards design. And we're going to have this other class of students, and it'll be a really important thing, I think, for higher ed, student affairs and academic affairs to keep their pulse on, is that population of students that doesn't have access to the K-12 system that is innovating in those ways.
Yeah.
I'd like to throw in something else there. I mean, because of what Greg just said, I think one of the most critically important things we can do is to educate the higher ed faculty about the brain science, because that is something that academic faculty will want to know about and will be fascinated by, and then help them learn how to transition to new ways of teaching and learning, both with technology and in face-to-face conversations. And there are a couple of chapters in the book about that. But if academic faculty don't understand that this is science-based information about how people learn, they won't do it. They'll just keep on doing what they've always been doing because there's no evidence that they're aware of that this other way works better. So we really need to do faculty development in this area in order to facilitate that transition that Greg was talking about.
Well, and personally, I just love when neuroscience and brain science merges with 3,000-year-old contemplative practices.
Oh, don't you?
I do. And so that brings us to this great book,
Yep.
Senti Pensante, from Laura Rendon, which I bought when I was finishing my doctorate. And it was one of those books that I was excited to read and then just stayed on the shelf and didn't quite get read. And so this was an opportunity to push me to read. I just loved it. It was a wonderful conversation about critical pedagogy and contemplative practices in the inner and the outer life by Lauren Rendon. So I really appreciate it. And Vijay, you had an opportunity to be a part of the conversation that led to that. So I'd love just to hear about your experience with that and your understanding of Senti Pensante for folks who are unfamiliar, and how you've applied that and how it has kind of emerged for you over really the past 10 years.
Sure. So Laura Rendon, Professor Rendon, is Professor Emerita at the University of Texas, San Antonio. She was my major professor. There's a story behind that, but I'll keep it short in saying that she was my advisor and major professor and an academic mother, if you will, right, in terms of nurturing and showing me the ropes through higher ed. And when I started my doctoral program at Iowa State, go Cyclones, In 2005, she was starting to work on this book, and she was a FETSA fellow, and had a grant through the FETSA Foundation to do an inquiry about the purpose of education, and so the book came along, and she started writing it since 1999, but more so got to it, finally grappled with all of the questions she had, the interviews, and it got published, I believe, in 2009. But from 2005 to 2009, I was a research assistant and helped her with the process. I don't think I understood what we were doing. I don't understand. She knew what she was doing. I was learning along the way. But it became more clearer to me when I happened to TA the first class that she used the book for. Right? We had a class in Senti Pensante in the doctoral program, and I happened to be part of the class, but also help TA the course. And Senti Pensante, in a way, if you think about it, it's sentir and pensar. The sentir, which is the sensing, the intuition of inner knowing, if you will, and pensar, the intellectual and the scholarship-based ways of understanding, is the way that she frames the book, and it speaks to the idea of how do faculty acknowledge and work with first-generation limited income students in our college classrooms. And it's a pedagogy of wholeness, social justice, and liberation, as the title of the book says. And I think part of her quest was, in writing the book, was to understand, if you look at the traditional classroom space that we have, most of our classrooms are dehumanizing, and we experience colonized ways of understanding, imperial ways of knowing and being. And this book tends to reframe those ways of pedagogical ways of engaging in the classroom by creating new agreements. And she uses Don Miguel Ruiz's 4 agreements concept in a way, and connects inner wisdom and knowing with outer ways of being and doing. And so it was very powerful for me to see that, and it helped me understand the colonized ways of understanding that I had gotten used to, in the ways that I was engaging with my doctoral research. And so since then, I've actually adopted that as part of my framework, pedagogical framework in all of my courses. It's been fascinating to see how students embrace it. And at times there are challenges, of course, with any pedagogical framework that we use. And for me specifically, one example that I want to share today was how, and the book talks about it, the Cajitas project that Professor Alberto Pulido, he's at the University of San Diego, he was one who uses that in ethnic studies, and we ended up bringing it up into student affairs. And the Cajitas project invites students to develop the student affairs philosophy, if you will. And the inquiry for the assignment, if you will, it's a final assignment. It's not graded, but what I ask students to do is ponder and think about the original reason why the student decided to become an educator. And I think Jane was talking about, we talk about being educators, and I think oftentimes in student affairs we typically the first response that I always get is, I want to help students, right? And which is great, but I want to go deeper than that, right? Helping students is more of a superficial way of understanding, and I want to come from a place of what is the need to provide that help. How do you want to help in ways that you've been impacted either by mentors, events in your life, and things of that nature. So it becomes a very powerful example of connecting inner wisdom, ancestral wisdom, and indigenous. And again, I also invite students to think about ancestral ways of knowing that more often than not we tend to neglect in our classrooms, right? And so it's probably one of the most powerful assignments that I have. And I tend to reframe it, reuse it in different ways for other courses. But that's a big one that I am fascinated about, and ends up being students tend to use that as part of their final capstone projects in terms of describing the level of cognition, the affect, the way that we, Jane, you described about cognition, affect, behavior, metacognition, in terms of having even aha moments as they're presenting their final capstone projects. So
you're reminding me that the neuroscience now is talking that it's not just our intellectual knowing, but also how we emotionally consume things, which is a little bit about that inner wisdom, but also how we embody that learning, which is by movement or mindfulness or being present. It can be a really great learning tool. And what you're pointing me to, Vijay, is not just our ancestral ways of knowing, but then how does intergenerational trauma, and what we're learning about intergenerational trauma and oppression, factor into this. And we're seeing that very scientifically with epigenetics about how we're turning on or turning off different genes to survive and navigate those traumas. So it's a really, really exciting sort of time to be a part of that. I also want to caution us that we have to be careful, I think, as educators to not remember our transformative moments and try and replicate those with students, because they may not be in the place, they may not be ready for that. Mm-hmm. So how do we, just like you don't want a conduct hearing officer imagining their residence hall when they were a student, because it's a very different environment that the student they're working with can be in. How do we step outside of how we learn and refocus on how did these students learn? What is the best way for them to learn?
Yeah, and I think if you were to talk to Dr. Rendon, right, she would tell you that this pedagogical model isn't for everybody, right? That when I introduced the concept in the pedagogy of the classroom, obviously there's a little bit of struggle in terms of nobody having had this kind of an approach before in their lives and their educational trajectories. And when you come to the end of the classroom, students absolutely love it, or there are students who absolutely hate it, right? Where to them it's part of the reason is, well, I don't understand why I have to do this, right? I had a student in a course before, end of the course, she ended up coming up and saying, I haven't had these kinds of experiences. We had a student who talked about their parent getting deported. We had a student who talked about being from a country where there was war, and then the student comes in and talks about, well, I don't relate to any of those, and those are fine examples, but I've had a perfectly fine life, right? But in that moment, you also can recognize the privilege the student has, and so there's that opportunity to have that conversation if the student is willing to have that conversation, and it becomes. Pedagogically, it becomes a tool for deep reflection in ways that I don't think a traditional classroom space would allow.
Absolutely.
Right. And how do we create spaces where students are willing to go to those difficult places, either go to the place of their privilege or go to the place of their trauma or their experiences? And go ahead, Jane.
Let me throw something in, because my training is in counseling, and I'm a professional counselor, and I found, not intentionally, but very usefully, that you can use all kinds of just basic active listening skills in the classroom to make the classroom a safe place for people, because that's another one of the breaking of the norms. People are sitting in chairs facing forward to the teacher, and they're not used to talking to each other, so of course you have to move the furniture. But part of what you teach students is how to listen to each other. Thich Nhat Hanh would call that deeply. Carl Rogers would call it active listening, but whatever you call it, I think one of the most important things, if we want to do social justice work, one of the most important things we can do is teach people empathy, which unfortunately, we're not wired to be empathic to tribes that are different than our own, or ethnic groups or identity groups or whatever. We're wired to be empathic to about 30 people who pretty much are like us. But the challenge of the modern era is everybody's here and they're all in class together, and what are you going to do about it? And you don't want to just teach information, because so what? Then they know a lot of stuff, good for them, and then they go home and be privileged. What we want is for everybody to realize we're all human beings and people suffer from this. And if you can do something to alleviate the suffering, then you really need to know how to do that. if you care. And if you don't care, then, well, that's another conversation. But I think people can learn to be empathic if they're not damaged. And people are empathic and don't know that they're empathic. They can learn to use empathy to understand. And I guess that's the important thing that I like to throw in here.
And how do we as educators do our own healing from our own past experiences, do our own exploration of our privilege, do our own healing, so that we're not using the classroom to have the students meet our healing needs, right?
Absolutely.
Our unmet needs, which then ends up with this helping not as a way of empowering students, but as a way of enabling students so that they love us and affirm us and we get some of that met.
Right.
I would encourage people who want to know more about this, creating the space that Vijay and Jane are both pointing to Brian Arau and Christie's Clemens' great work around from safe space to brave space and really tangible ways we can create environments where people can really explore that. But Greg, we're into Thich Nhat Hanh and brave space and art as pedagogy and intergenerational trauma. And we'd love for you to talk about some of the ways that you've been exploring how we bridge the science and the innovation and social media technological tools, both in your role working with folks in the classroom, and how we can bring some of the learning there to the learning outside of the classroom.
Well, I like Jane's comment about rearranging the furniture, because I think it's a truism on the physical space of teaching, but I think it's also true in the organization and structure of higher ed in a very philosophical kind of way. And I think student affairs folks need to be the ones who are going to rearrange the furniture. And this will sound negative to my faculty friends, but when you're in the tenure track, and I'm in the tenure track, it's real easy to get myopic and get so focused. Even though you want to help students, even though you love your content area, you are focused on having a job in 4 years and making sure you meet the metrics for tenure. And I think that there's this great opportunity for student affairs and academic affairs to really work together to open up the classroom walls. And I don't know exactly what that looks like. I think, 10 years ago, I thought that might look like Twitter and might look like student affairs folks TAing in a first-year seminar and partnering with academic folks in a first-year seminar and having conversations, not in the classroom on Twitter, but outside of the classroom on Twitter. So I don't know that I have the answer, but I think that part of it is language. We need to, I think, like Jane said early on, we need to bridge the gap on the language, because I think a book chapter about scientific teaching might have been the book chapter you just skip over because that's from the student affairs side, not something you want to know about. But really, it's all of what traditional student affairs training would be focused on. It's about backwards design and creating learning outcomes and activities that address those learning outcomes and summative and formative assessments to measure those learning outcomes. And just because the language doesn't align doesn't mean that the student affairs person and the scientists can't align, because that's how the scientists are talking about teaching biology and teaching chemistry and teaching physics. It's about scientific teaching and backwards design. And so I think there's a great opportunity there to really bridge the gap. And again, I don't want to be prescriptive, because I think every campus is different, every university is different. It's about building relationships. It's about extending your hand across the aisle and offering the services that we can offer to each other to really open up the classroom walls, to think about a 3-credit biology class and how do we get that student to spend 3 or 4 more hours talking about biology? Well, it used to be coming into office hours and going to the library. And now we need to be thinking about how we can get them on YouTube and Zoom videos with their faculty, and how can we have them tweeting at each other, whatever that looks like, snapping at each other, whatever works for your faculty. But I think that partnership can, and in a lot of ways needs to be driven by student affairs. And I don't want to put the weight on student affairs shoulders, but I don't see that there's going to be a faculty member that walks into the residence hall and asks the hall director to be a partner in a biology class anytime soon. But if somebody has an interest in a content area and they reach across the aisle, I don't know too many faculty that would turn down some support, some folks that want to help engage their students. And I think we want to have hard conversations. about privilege, about the things that matter in society. But sometimes we as faculty, scientists as faculty, don't have those skill sets, and we don't know who does. We don't know higher ed administration and structure and who, exists in the student affairs world, probably like student affairs does. And so I think that's a great opportunity for folks to really partner. One thing I'm really excited about and that I wanted to share, I think, my world of using technology to extend the classroom walls has shifted over time. And one of the projects we're working on right now is with Lower Brule Research, which is a nonprofit that runs on the Lower Brule American Indian Reservation here in South Dakota. And we are using a mentoring program that we've used kind of traditionally in our first year seminars, and really transitioning that mentoring and learning, taking the learning and success that we've had in that mentoring program and using it to mentor high school and middle school students that are doing summer research projects, tribal-focused, community-focused research projects on their campus. And we're using technology because even for our students who are focused and dedicated, it's a 4-hour drive from our campus to that reservation. And so we spent time face-to-face doing the student affairs stuff, right? Getting to know each other and doing icebreakers and all that. But we also spent time focused on developing their research projects. And I think so I brought, or there was a partnership between me and another academic advisor on our campus. And I think without the student affairs higher ed training that the two of us brought, traditional faculty wouldn't have come in thinking about building relationships, wouldn't have thought about and valued cultural competencies, I think. And I know that sounds negative. I'm not trying to be negative to science faculty, but we tend to go where we're comfortable, and science faculty are comfortable jumping into science content. Let's teach them about how to design a research experience, an experiment. Let's teach them about botany. Let's jump into content. And I think we found a really good balance there. But we have to use technology, and we're assessing that. We've got learning outcomes set up and are assessing how we're using Zoom and how are we mentoring those students between a college student and a high school student. How are we using Slack to communicate? How are the students using Slack to communicate with each other? So I think, big picture, I think we have to be scientific. We've got to have our heart. I agree with the previous speakers and the whole group here and the book that you're referring to. We've got to have a heart and context and think about the way that those integrate. But we also have to be scientific if we want our faculty members in the other silo on our campus to value us. We've got to be talking about neuroscience. We've got to be talking about how students really learn. We have to have strong assessments linked to our learning outcomes, whatever that might be. So,
and thankfully,
I feel like I rambled a lot there, but
yeah, no, and thankfully those aren't conflict. How we
without a doubt,
neuroscience and brain science, template of practices really line up.
Yep.
I think we're getting a bit of an echo. Maybe if Greg, you might be able to mute, that might help. We got that taken care of. I think this is really great because, Greg, as you're talking about technology in these different ways and teaching, I think the place where student affairs has a challenge is that our responsibility is to do direct education like faculty with the students we supervise, with the students who maybe are in a leadership program. But we also have to design the indirect student interaction. So how do we foster student learning when we're not going to be there? So how do we create systems and structures that support and reinforce and scaffold student learning in developmentally appropriate ways when I'm not going to be in the room, when I'm not going to be a part of the conversation, when it doesn't happen in my office? And so I just love to throw it open now to our three panelists. We've got a little bit of time before we need to begin moving to the wrap up. And I'd love to hear some of the very concrete and real strategies that you see as really promising or exciting or that you're utilizing. We've already talked about stand-up comedy. We've talked about mindfulness. We've talked about art. We've talked about social media. We've talked about Slack. We've talked about Snapchat. We're off to a great start. What would be some of these other strategies that you see holding a lot of promise in facilitating student learning?
I want to throw something in here because I don't want to write any more books, even though we're writing another book, but I want to write something that says I don't believe in techniques. Because we know how people learn developmentally. We used to know what an 18-year-old was capable of. We don't know that anymore because of all the things that have happened to alter possibly brain development, certainly social development. But I think what we have is a framework for what is age appropriate, what is time appropriate, and what kinds of activities. Like if you look, I did a consulting job at Southern Utah University a couple of months ago. Phenomenal school, plug for them, because they have to do experiential education from freshman year to senior year, but they have sequenced a whole bunch of activities in each year so that the students identify what they want to do for their project, figure out where they're going to do it, and they go through increasingly complex forms of planning so that when they get to their senior year, they go out in the wilderness and restore some place that's been destroyed by some human intervention, or they go to Mexico and give out drugs to people who can't afford drugs. I mean, they do amazing things there, but they start at the beginning of knowing that, Perry was right. Tell me what to do. You're in charge, and then let me lead you. But part of the leading is to set up a group and give them a job, and then they'll do it. And then when they don't know what they're doing, they'll come back and we'll go to the next step. So I really believe that we don't have to be in the room. Part of the model of teaching is I do it and you have it done to you. And that's all a structure of the English language. That is a function of grammar. Learning happens. Teaching, whatever teaching is, if learning doesn't happen, what is that? That's the question. So people learn all the time, every place. And the question is, how do we sequence events, create environments, set norms in groups? How do we set up rules so that everybody has to listen to everybody? And that, bigoted behavior is not permitted and that sort of thing. And once you have the general framework of how people learn and what's sequentially appropriate, techniques have to be specific to that particular thing. I do not believe in cookbooks except for cooking. Why did you get a master's degree if you can't use it to think about your job? That's kind of my idea about that.
Well, and I think you're pointing to an example of what I would call problem-based learning. And I think in the academic world, we talk a lot about problem-based learning, and we work with a social agency or community agency or business to do that. But in our realm, we have so many problems on campus that we can engage in directly. We don't need to go somewhere else and find problems or worse yet, invent some made up problems.
Right.
We have sexual violence on campus. We have food insecurity on campus. We have students who are minoritized and marginalized in the classroom and beyond the classroom. We have access issues. We have so many challenges that we can take on and engage in this problem-based learning. But Jay, what are some of the pedagogies that you're most excited about right now?
Well, not so much about pedagogies, but I'm just thinking about, I think, a couple of comments that Jane and Greg had mentioned earlier. Just thinking about student affairs as a platform, as a vehicle to enact change on our college campuses. One thing that I'm always wanting to think about, or at least focus on, is student affairs, as we know, as a profession, as part of most of our college campuses, typically tends to be white. If I had to take race as a construct, right? And so, and rooted in white ways of understanding or white ways of doing things. And so, when we think about these other ways of doing, other ways of knowing, other ways of being, how are our student affairs professionals getting ready for? I mean, and thinking about student affairs programs, especially, and because of that, student affairs faculty engaging with the students in our classrooms to get them ready for the market, the workplace, in terms of another college campus where they have to go address issues of whether it's race or racism, sexuality, identity issues, right? So think of the gamut of identities that we have and issues that we have to deal with on our college campuses, and how are we preparing our future student affairs professionals to do that? And that's always a fascinating question for me to think about.
Yeah, and as Jane was saying, there isn't a three-step process to always answer that, right? It's a little bit more complicated and requires us to be present with the challenges and be present with the learners. The four of us probably all learn in very different ways, and so how do we navigate that? Greg, what are some of the most exciting pedagogies that you're seeing, that you're playing with or are being inspired by?
Well, I'll go straight to a technology that I think student affairs probably needs to engage with, and I think that's artificial intelligence and machine learning. I think as we look at how students are going to be recruited, mentored, advised, communicated with from an institutional level, it's very possible that AI and machine learning, dies on the vine and we don't hear another thing about it. But in terms of the economical payoff that I'm seeing from some of these startups around recruiting students, and then even getting into advising bots interacting with students in terms of their communication with the institution, I think we need to be the advocates to ensure that marginalized populations are not left out of that code. And that's probably not the right terminology, but the reality being that AI and machine learning is going to be built on, in a lot of cases, the masses, the majority populations, and making sure that as we think about increasing what every VP for enrollment management wants to do is, increase recruitment and retention. I think we have to be really cautious about being able to do that on paper. But what ways are we leaving behind students that either are in tech deserts and they don't have access to some of that technology, students that the code and the machine learning wasn't built upon, and so the communication style and structure and the way of knowing is not built on their way of knowing, and what that really looks like. And I don't mean that to be student affairs needs to dig their heels in and say this is bad and this is wrong, but I think student affairs needs to make sure that they're at the table and that it's not only enrollment management or that it's not only academic advising folks that are having those conversations, because I see that coming down the pike, and I think there could be some real great value add around artificial intelligence and machine learning in student communication and recruitment. But I think we just have to be really cautious, and we need to be the advocates at the table.
So we started off with these two books, right, which are kind of guiding the conversation today. I saw Jane recommended Radical Dharma, which we got tweeted out. We also tweeted out the Tree of Contemplative Practices.
Oh, yes.
From the good folks, so people can see that there are lots of different ways to engage. I also want to recommend Marilee Bragiani-Ludwig's book on the neuroscience of learning and development as a really great one to bring in some of the neuroscience and the brain science and how we're learning and how that really fits in with some of these embodied learning and how we navigate that. What other resources or suggestions would you have for folks who really want to learn more about the process of facilitating learning?
I did a book last year called Of Education, Fishbowls and Rabbit Holes. And it is the entertainment version of what Marilee did. And it was designed to be entertaining. It's almost a 2-day self-training program. But what I tried to do was deconstruct Western mythology about how people are, quote unquote, individuals, how we learn, why objectivity is just one point of view, which is kind of an irony. And it's full of exercises and activities and little rabbits running around. And it's short. So I recommend that book because I loved writing it and it's selling reasonably well. And faculty are using it for faculty read to help people kind of see the big picture. The fishbowls in the title is, can you see your own frame of reference?
Great.
Once you see that, then maybe you can start looking at maybe yours doesn't match anybody else's in particular areas. So I hope people read that book. I really feel like that was a contribution I wanted to make.
Great. Vijay, Greg, what are resources and suggestions?
A resource that's on many campuses, I think, is a Center for Teaching and Learning. And many times I think student affairs doesn't feel like they belong because they're maybe not on the email listserv. They're maybe not thought of in a traditional educational sense when those communications happen. But I think most centers for teaching and learning would welcome student affairs practitioners. And I think it would be beneficial in two ways. I think it's beneficial on an individual and programmatic level for student affairs to learn the language, to be given some time and training in these areas. But I also think it's a perfect opportunity to share the work that student affairs does across the aisle, because a lot of these are workshops. A lot of these are active learning, working in groups, doing presentations. I think it'd just be a great way to communicate the learning outcomes that student affairs is meeting that the folks in biology and chemistry and engineering don't even know what's going on, right? They just, they don't know what's happening in the residence halls. They don't know what's happening in those student organizations or in the worlds in which a lot of student affairs folks work. So I feel like there's a missed opportunity on many campuses to engage in that space.
That's a great suggestion. I mean, I just think it's a wonderful place to learn. It's a wonderful place to share. It's also just a wonderful place for student affairs professionals to build relationships with faculty who are in that space talking about not how they have it right, but how they're struggling and how they're wrestling, how they're overwhelmed with this and students struggling with this and really seeking solutions. It's a wonderful space to be a part of. Vijay, any resources or suggestions you have for folks?
Thinking about contemplative education, I'm thinking about contemplative practices in higher education. It's a book by Daniel Barbazat and Mirbai Bush, who are at the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society in Massachusetts. That's one book. And then another book by a good friend of mine, Beth Berla. She is the director of the Women's Studies program and is a full professor there at St. Cloud State, Minnesota. And her book is titled Integrating Mindfulness into Anti-Oppression Pedagogy, Social Justice in Higher Education. And this is not so much of a student affairs book per se, but for students that are now probably in the doctoral programs and thinking about dissertation topics, but engaging with research about pedagogy. People might want to consider Linda Tuhiwai-Smith's Decolonizing Methodologies book to think about how what does a decolonizing pedagogy look like, and so to engage with those. So 3 things that come to my mind right now.
That's really great. I think maybe people saw me turning around looking at my shelf. The one I was looking for was Beth Barilla's book to make sure I got the title right, and you just got it. So thank you so much for bringing that in, Vijay. Wonderful to have that be a part of it. We've got Erica Thompson is managing the hashtag. She's doing a great job of tweeting out links on Amazon to all these books and resources that people are mentioning. So folks want to follow along there. Some great ways if you're having trouble taking notes. She's pretty fast at that. Where would you point people who want to do a better job of thinking about pedagogy? I'm particularly thinking about Greg, as you were talking about the backward design. And really thinking about what do we want students to learn? How are we going to teach it? How do we do summative and formative assessment so that the assessment is part of their learning? And how do we do that? That's really what the Institute on Curricular approach is about. I mean, that's the whole curricular approach, is being clear about what we want students to learn, then thinking about strategies, and then doing assessment and doing a better job of that. I think I've had so many experiences in student affairs where what we do is we think about what have we done? And then how do we write learning outcomes to match that so that our assessment will show us that we're going to be okay, which is not what we have done. But that backward design is a great example of that. So that's something that I'm thinking about. What are other, we talked about books and resources. Are there other opportunities that are really engaging you around some of this?
Teaching Tolerance, which is from the Southern Poverty Law Center, has wonderful lessons start to finish, including assessments, and theoretically it's for K-12, but all you have to do is just kind of tweak the developmental level of the students, and they have really good guidance.
Yeah, very scripted, very, very detail oriented. Many of their resources are.
I'm just thinking, I think Greg had mentioned about Centers for Teaching and Learning, and we have the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning program at the University of Vermont, and I'm a fellow of the program this semester. And something that going through the program midway, what I realized was how in some ways Centers for Teaching and Learning typically tend to perpetuate ways of pedagogical, or inflict pedagogical trauma in the classroom, right? And so something that I brought up in our conversations with my group, and because of that, we ended up actually we're shifting the ways that we've been talking about pedagogy. And so I'm thinking about, what are Centers for Teaching and Learning on our college campuses doing to ensure that pedagogy is not a singular way of understanding?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Greg, did you want to add anything into that about things you want to recommend or suggest?
Well, I'll put one more plug in for Jane and Ruth's edited book and the chapter we wrote on scientific teaching. And I'd just say again, I don't think it needs to scare you off, because I think it's a 2-page template. I think it would work for putting on a residence hall program to anything else that happens in student affairs. And it's a really great way to kind of do backwards design. And it's based right out of Joe Handelsman's book from AAAS on scientific teaching. And I just think it's got this ability to be applied outside of science. And I think it then gives us a common language. So I would say that. And I would just reiterate Vijay's comment about engaging and I think pushing centers for teaching and learning to think about things and think about ways of knowing differently, because I don't know that that's their background. They're, a lot of centers for teaching and learning directors and assistant directors come straight from academe in the purest sense. They were physicists yesterday and they are center for teaching and learning directors today. And I think they would welcome that in a lot of cases, that conversation, and especially if it comes with, it's backed up by literature and research, that's what they're going to want if that's kind of their background. So I would just reiterate, I think that's a fair critique of centers for teaching and learning, and I think a place where student affairs folks come to the table can really help them to grow and move in the right direction.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank all three of you, and to the many folks participating and listening, either live or in the follow-up, and for those who participated in the conversation on Twitter. Thanks to all of our guests today, and thanks always to our program sponsor. Please join us for future episodes of Student Affairs Live. You can learn more about these and other episodes by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter. You can also review past episodes by browsing the archives at higheredlive.com or subscribe to the iTunes podcast. Please pay attention to upcoming episodes with your regular hosts, Tony Duty and Heather Shea. I'm Keith Edwards, guest hosting for Heather Shea. Thanks for watching, everyone. We hope you make it a great week, and good luck facilitating all that learning out there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.